Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this MPC webinar and the book launch on Governing Migration Beyond the State by Andrew Geddes. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this event. And I just want to say a thank you to everybody out there and also to our discussant. And I would say, or I would like to mention that this book Andrew will present today goes a long way back. It is based on an European Research Council advance grant that was led by Professor Andrew Geddes. And it really involved research with activists on the Texan border up to interviews with migration governance actors in Geneva. So this book is truly based on research on a multi-level and multi-actor perspective beyond and within key migration nations across the globe. And I'm looking very much forward to hear more from Andrew, the author himself, who wrote this book, and our two wonderful discussants. Thanks so much again to Sandra and David Fitzgerald for joining us. I think both of them, they don't need an introduction. Their names speak for themselves. So just very briefly, Professor Fitzgerald is a chair in US-Mexico relations at UC San Diego. And as most of you will know, that he published just recently a book on Immigrants California, Understanding Past, Present and Future of US Policies, also Refugee Beyond Reach. And also Sandra Lavenex, who is Professor of European and International Politics at the University of Geneva, and also author of numerous publications on migration governance from a global, regional, and multi-level perspective. So both wonderful discussants for a book that is really truly global and multi-level and regional. So thanks so much for everyone. I don't take up much more time, and I would directly ask Professor Geddes to start with his presentation on the book. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laila. Thank you very much for the intro. As Laila said, the book is based on a 5-year European Research Council project, which is called Prospects for International Migration Governance. And any project like this really requires a team of people. And I was really lucky to have a great team of people. So I would like to acknowledge that the work as part of the 5-year project Prospects for International Migration Governance involved Laila Haji Abdu, who's kindly agreed to chair this session, but also Jason Freeman, Marcida Espinoza, Gabriel Ibarra, Diego Acosta, Nicola Phillips, Leza Brumat, and we also had 4 fantastic PhD students who've all completed their PhDs as part of the project: Michaela Bruckmeyer, Laura Foley, Luca Lixi, and Andrea Petrakin. So they've made enormous contributions to this research, and also the work they've done, important scholars in their own right, work that came out of this project, which has been a fantastic thing for me to be involved in. And also today to have the opportunity to discuss the book with Sandra and David's really great for me, because two people whose work has had such a huge influence on what I've tried to do. So it's a great pleasure that they've agreed to join us today. I'm very happy about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the methodology of the book, but what I will do is just very briefly say that as part of the book we spoke, as Laila said, across levels of governance, but what that meant in effect was talking or doing more than 400 interviews in 23 countries, or 24 countries, sorry, plus also with international organizations and regional organizations at different scales and sites within multi-level migration governance systems. So what I'm going to do today then is talk a little bit about the book, but I wanted to start by trying to orient you towards the focus of the book, because the book is on the governance of migration. And this is a picture which, I'm not, we could interpret this picture in very many different ways. What I'll just do is tell you the story of this picture. On the right, as you look at it, you've got the German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer. Next to him is the Turkish Interior Minister, Soylu. Next to him is the former EU Migration Commissioner, Avramopoulos. And next to him is the French Ambassador to Turkey. And they met in October 2019 in Ankara. So these people met in Ankara. What they were there to do was discuss irregular sea crossings from Turkey to Greece. And the reason they were meeting was because of because of this concern about what they saw as irregular crossings, of which are around 12,000 in September 2019, so the month before the meeting. People were traveling relatively short distances by boat from Turkey to Greek islands. And in that time, the Financial Times reported the number of arrivals was far below its October 2015 peak, when 210,000 people crossed between Turkey and Greece in a single month. But the Financial Times, in their report of this meeting, went on to say that the increase in numbers in September 2019 had caused alarm among political leaders, worried about the impact that a further surge could have on EU nations. This is how the Financial Times reported it. And it was this final phrase, which I think gets to the heart of some of the issues that I'm interested in this book. You know, the EU leaders were reported as being alarmed about what would happen if numbers of migrants increased. And this alarm might be well-founded, but then again, it might not. But it depends upon a perception of what is happening. And that's what informs the approach that I take in this book. Because what we have here is a representation of a possible future event, shaping actions based on understandings of what happened in the past, of what was going on at the time, and of what might happen in the future. And it depends to a considerable extent on perception. There are facts, there is data, there is evidence, there is information, but it is filtered by values, beliefs, and experiences. And put together, I would see these as illustrating what I will call the drivers of migration governance. And that's what this book that I'm going to talk about today is focused on. The drivers of migration governance, and how actors, in this case, in this photograph, political leaders, how actors of various types try to make sense of, well, what's going on out there, of the environment, the context in which they operate. So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the structure of the book and also what I'll do in today's talk, because as soon as I started trying to do a PowerPoint, I realized it's impossible to condense a book into a PowerPoint. So I'll tell you what is in the book. So there are 8 chapters. The first chapter, well, is a kind of, is an introductory, a short introductory chapter. Chapter 2 introduces a kind of key organizing idea for the book, what I call repertoires of migration governance. And I'll talk about that in more detail later on. Then there are 5 core empirical chapters that look at a regional level, because the book is interested in particular in governance beyond the state, in regional level. I look at Southeast Asia, South America, the European Union, and North America, what used to be known as NAFTA. And then there's a chapter on prospects for global migration governance before a concluding chapter. Now, I think it will be impossible to condense that into one 25-minute talk. So this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to present an overview of the book, the questions it addresses, the arguments that I try to develop. I'm going to explain a little bit more about this key idea, this idea of repertoires of migration governance. I can't go into all the details of the cases. So what I'm going to do is effectively just draw from chapter 2, where I put forward some issues or questions which I think confront actors in everyday migration governance. So people, elite actors involved in everyday migration governance, 5 questions which I think they have to address. And I'll illustrate these questions, these issues, with some material from the book as well, just to give you a sense of how I approach this analysis. So the questions the book addresses, well, the first question, the most fundamental question, and it's expressed over 6 lines, so I'll go through it quite slowly so that I try and get the main point across, because this is really about the orientation of the book. The book is interested in how migration governance actors, and by actors, I mean particularly elite actors that seek to make, shape, or influence policy. So how migration governance actors of various types, so that can be political leaders, officials at national level, international level, regional level, business, trade unions, civil society organizations, researchers in think tanks or universities, a range of actors with obviously power relationships within those actor fields, how actors of various types in 4 world regions, Europe, North America, South America, and Southeast Asia, how they make sense of international migration. Or put more intuitively, and I'll explain a little bit more about this later on, I would argue that they're all fundamentally trying to address two questions. What's going on out there, what's happening? And on the basis of some understanding or representation of what is going on, what should we do next? And I, as I'll explain a little bit more fully later on, I think this kind of question, these questions come from all actors involved in organizations that are seeking to make, shape, or influence migration governance. I then look at how these representations that emerge, inform or shape subsequent actions and inactions, because of course doing nothing is also a possibility. How these representations then affect the prospects for migration governance beyond the state, which again is the key focus for the book, and also how these representations then affect migration itself, because through the categories, classifications, and the practices that are developed, because another argument that's developed through the book is a focus on governance effects, that governance systems themselves play a very powerful role in shaping international migration. And then at a more empirical level, how do these dynamics play out in 4 very different regions where the meaning of migration, governance, and the state can differ? And so the regions that are the particular focus are the European Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Common Market of the South Mercosur, and what used to be known as NAFTA. So for much of the analysis, NAFTA was in existence and obviously is now being replaced with an organization which in terms of its kind of migration scope is still very, very, very limited. So now to give you a sense of some of the arguments that are developed. One point which I emphasize throughout the book is what I call the representations of the normality of international migration create a sensible environment. And I'll explain a little bit of what I mean by this, because I think there's a tendency to focus on crises as drivers of, for instance, change in governance systems. But what I argue in this book is that representations of the normality, what is understood or perceived as normal about international migration, create what I call a sensible environment. And the word sensible environment derives from the literature on what's called sense making in organizational studies. A sensible environment is one that makes sense to the actors involved. It is plausible, but not necessarily accurate. It may be accurate, it may not, but it is plausible. And so and this is a point that I'll refer to again in this presentation. But understandings of what is the normal about international migration play a powerful role in creating sensible environments. And so just to give you one example of what I mean by that, chapter 3 of the book looks at what is entitled The Temporariness of Migration in Southeast Asia. And I would argue, or do argue in that chapter, that the normality of international migration in Southeast Asia, kind of a sensible environment that is created, is one in which migrant workers are actually referred to as temporary foreign workers, and also in which protection of the displaced also has a temporary framework which began with the Comprehensive Plan of Action in relation to the conflict in Vietnam in the 70s and 80s, but where the idea is of temporary protection in the region or resettlement beyond the region. Now, there are other examples throughout the book of this, but it's this idea about the normality of migration as creating this sensible environment which is plausible to key actors in migration governments and gives them a basis to proceed. These sensible environments, as I've mentioned, are plausible, not necessarily accurate. Accuracy is nice, but not necessary. The second main argument is that governance systems themselves are key drivers of migration. I think I've already made this point, that governance is what I want to explain in the analysis in this book, and variation in governance across regions. The distinct repertoires of migration governance develop at a regional level, and I'll develop that point in the next slide. I also argue for the centrality of regions to the study of migration governance beyond the state, because we know that migration itself is powerfully regional, but we also know that regions in their various forms, so regional organizations are very different, but they are significant loci for action. They mediate the relationship between the global and the national. And we also know they can be significant producers of norms and standards themselves. This leads to the final argument, which I make, is that it is more likely that the global will be regionalised, made consistent with regional norms and standards, and that regions are globalised. And that becomes particularly relevant in chapter 7 of the book, where I look at prospects for global migration governance and its relationship to regional norms and standards. So those are the main arguments that the book develops. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the organising idea, this idea of repertoires of migration governance, because I think it's really central to the approach I take in the book to the study of migration governance. So, I mean, some kind of headline bullet points. Well, migration governance, well, is always everywhere necessary an organisational process. There are many organisations involved, but migration governance is necessarily an organisational process. What this means is it requires actors of various types in these organisational settings to organise their experiences, both of migration and of the wider environment within which they operate. So the organisation of these experiences then shapes actions, inactions, inclusions and exclusions of migration and migrants. So this is really trying to explain a kind of perspective on governance that I take in the book, how I understand governance and how I understand migration governance. And so just develop this point a little bit more. How our experience is organised? Well, I think the first dimension of that is what could be called social and cognitive, what actors know how to do. So, and by this I mean the way in which the experiences of people, their use of facts, information, data and evidence are influenced by values and beliefs, and then can coalesce through interaction with others into knowledge of, about, for or against international migration. So I think what actors know how to do is a very important part of migration governance. And here, I begin the book by saying that migration governance exists in the shadow of uncertainty, where facts and data elide with values and beliefs. And so what actors know how to do will be influenced by uncertainty, but also by this elision, this overlap between facts, data, evidence, but also the way those are filtered by values and beliefs. So experiences are organised, I think, in a social and cognitive way with what actors know how to do, but also in a second way, which is social expectations about role, what these actors think they're expected to do, how these actors understand, interpret and represent cues and signals from their environment, and how these cues and signals interact with values and beliefs at an organisational level to steer perceptions of issues, of challenges, of problems. So just as a very quick illustration of that, I think that perceptions of public attitudes, of what the public want, whether accurate or not, as I've said before, plausibility is the key, not necessarily accuracy. So plausible understandings of, say, public perceptions of migration can quite significantly influence social expectations about role, what actors think they are expected to do. So repertoires of migration governance, then, as I say, these have these two components which fundamentally relate to this issue of how experiences are organised, what actors know how to do and what they think they are expected to do. And these repertoires, I go through this point quite quickly. I argue in the book they have 5 components. They have a narrative component, which is factual beliefs that can actually stabilise governance systems. They're social, they're shaped by social interactions. Knowledge about migration develops in social settings and requires validation in those settings. They are effective in the sense that people often respond at the emotional level to migration, but also can have an emotional attachment to values and beliefs. They're performative, these repertoires, because often being seen to do something is important in itself. And they are ongoing. People are always in the middle of things. Migration governance doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's an ongoing process. So those are the kind of components of these repertoires and migration governance, which are kind of an organising argument of the book. So what I wanted to do now in the time I've got left is draw from something I develop in chapter 2, where I put forward 5 questions that are expressed intuitively, which I would argue confront actors in everyday migration governance. And so these are the 5 questions. I'm going to go through them one at a time and just bring in some of the material from the book to provide an illustration. As I said at the start, we did more than 400 interviews, so there's a lot of interview material in the book, but I'll just draw from little bits of it now. So the first question is, how can we figure out what's going on out there? Second, why do something when we don't know what effect it will have? The third question is, well, how can we choose our priorities? The fourth is, well, who are all these people at this meeting? And the fifth, well, does that make sense to us? So the first question, how can we figure out what's going on out there? Or I suppose as in the social science literature referred to as framing. And here I'm going to go right back to some work we did at the start, which I think is actually an interview in Brussels in December 2014 with an official from an EU agency. And this became almost like a symbolic quote for the project for various reasons, something we've kind of really kind of provided a kind of kickstart to some of the analysis. So this official said to us, well, yesterday I was at this meeting with the US, so the US government was present, the European Commission and others, I'm guessing others will be member states, international organizations, and everybody else, were repeatedly mentioning that this will be the new normal. 250,000 to 280,000 irregular migrants a year. That's basically what we have to count on in the foreseeable future. Nothing will change in this regard. I tend to agree, because as long as things are going the way they are going on in North Africa, sub-Saharan African countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, what have you, I don't see an end, unfortunately, to that. Now, the purpose of this project is not for me to assess this and say, well, is this an accurate statement? The purpose of this project is to look at how this kind of frame, this kind of perception of the underlying issues can have powerful effects, both in terms of what actors know how to do and what they're expected to do. Interestingly, a European Commission document then published in June 2016, about 18 months after the interview, this is a European Commission communication on relationship with third countries, non-EU member states, referred to external migratory pressure as the new normal, both for the EU and for partner countries, requires a more coordinated, systematic and structured approach to maximise synergies and leverages of the Union's internal and external policies. To succeed, it needs to reflect both the EU interests and interests of our partners, with clear objectives and a clear way forward on how the objectives will be achieved in terms of positive cooperation where possible, but the use of leverage where necessary. Now, obviously, it's interesting, this kind of reference of a new norm, which is a cliche, it's used in all kinds of contexts, but the kind of the use of language we found was quite interesting. But more than that, in terms of framing, there's a prognosis, an underlying prognosis here, which is very important in the European context, the idea of large-scale and potentially uncontrollable migration flows. Whether accurate or not, it contributes to this sensible environment. It is plausible to these kind of elite actors within the European Commission, the member states, and also in the United States. The kind of frame that's being developed has a prognostic component, what's going on, and also a diagnostic component in terms of what should be done, and also a motivational component with ideas around leverage and things like that. But that's just to illustrate this point about trying to figure out what's going on out there. Moving on to the second question, why do something when we don't know what effect it will have? Well, what I'm going to just use now is just some material from the US cases. And I think it was actually Lila who did these interviews. So the first one was of a Department of Justice official in Washington, DC in June 2015. And what we're interested in here is kind of the potential for status quo bias for countries in a position where action may be risky. And this quote from a DOJ official talked about immigration policy being reactive. So it's maybe not, it's transcribed as spoken, so it's sometimes maybe a bit difficult to interpret, but immigration policy is reactive. It seems to be limping along just fine. So why rock the boat? If we rock the boat, somebody might see us and want to make even more changes. That quote was expressed with some irony, the person saying it, but we also, this idea of why rock the boat? And then a DHS official, Department of Homeland Security, interviewed in the same month and said, well, I think there's a reluctance to do anything that might make the flood start again, the language, the flood start again. But also maybe a risk averseness, as it was put. So We don't know what stopped the floods, and this is referring in particular, I think, to child migration. There could be an increase in child migration that occurred the previous year. So anything, all of the actions we took, we're hesitant to change because any one of them could have been the one. Again, the kind of risk averseness. And why do something we don't know what effect it will have, which could, kind of status quo bias, reactive tendencies in migration governance. A third issue is, well, how can we choose our priorities? And here I'll draw from some material from Southeast Asia, where it was talking to somebody from an international organization in Bangkok in November 2016. And this person said, well, I don't want to sound cynical here, which is usually the universal indication that you are going to sound a bit cynical. But I don't want to sound cynical here, but me referring to what's called the Andaman Sea crisis of 2015, was incredibly useful for focusing the major government players, the governments of the region. Well, first of all, I guess it focused public perception, and then the governments of the region on the issues of migration and migrant smuggling and human trafficking. So my purpose here isn't to evaluate the accuracy or not of this statement. I'm interested in the kind of the effects that it has in terms of identifying priorities that could be evident at a regional level. Incredibly useful for focusing the major government players, the crisis, but in what way, where did it focus them? Well, it seemed to be focusing them on migrant smuggling, because it's been a lot easier for us to work off the back of that, because suddenly migrant smuggling, which was a crime that no one really knew much about, becomes a priority issue. Whereas before, I dare say, most of your average senior government officials wouldn't have really known much about it. So this becomes a priority issue, but I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details of the case. In Southeast Asia, we look at ASEAN, we also look at the Bali process, which brings Australia into the region through a regional consultation process. But the displacement of the Rohingya from Myanmar is now interpreted as an issue of migrant smuggling and of criminality, and so it becomes a priority issue defined in particular ways. I think this maybe illustrates the point I want to make about choosing priorities. The fourth question, well, who are all these people at this meeting? Again, this is a quote which actually refers to EU-African relations. It was a European Commission official in December 2015, talking about engagement with the Egyptians, but wider engagement in the Horn of Africa. So I'll try and explain a quote to you. So this person said to us, well, that's why the Egyptians like it, with all the meaning this kind of engagement on migration with the European Union. But that's why we, meaning the European Commission, said, listen, why don't we actually use that same venue and occasion to then also bring in our Horn of Africa initiative? And the European Union turned that into the Khartoum process, as it's known, a regional consultation process of the EU and the Horn of Africa. All the people will be there. It's sponsored by you, African Union, and we want you to retain an important role in this. Everybody would come, including Eritrea. Sponsored by you, the kind of ownership on the African side of a process, which actually initiated by the European Union. So the first formal start, the quote continues, first formal starting point, senior officials meeting, happened back to back the African Union conference in Khartoum, mid-October, on trafficking human beings. Senior officials brought a draft declaration. We had a first exchange with delegates on the text and the ambitions, what it would actually mean, how it would be implemented and all that. So all the delegates, this is a densely populated field becoming more densely populated, more people becoming involved in this, at governmental level, but an official level. Then there were bilateral, very heavy negotiations from October to the end of November in between Khartoum and Rome. We arrived in Rome where the declaration was endorsed at the ministerial level, and now we're preparing projects. So heavy negotiations, move into projects. But the point here, I think, is migration governance is a densely populated field and is intensely organizational. And as it stretches across levels, becomes more organizational. And the final question, does that make sense to us? Well, here are some material from an Argentinian government official. And the point I want to make here is really about these sensible environments, an environment which gives people a basis to proceed based on a plausible understanding of the issues, not necessarily accurate, but plausible. So this Argentinian government official said, well, the complexity of immigration is impacting every different sector of the government. It's not just immigration service, it's impacting the economy, education, health, security, development, so many places. We're trying to see if we can go forward in a kind of interministerial consulate for immigration. It's not just to create the place or the space to interact. But here, the complexity of immigration, but just saying something is complex is not good enough. Something there's there's often a requirement that something must be done. Obviously, we can see that the issues are complex, but organisations often produce a demand for action. So this person went on to say, well, it's what we need to do is to create the strength in the people who are going to work in this particular interaction. If you don't have the people with some skills in immigration, sometimes the result cannot be the best, it could be the worst. If you're going to talk with people from security and they don't have some skill about the real impact of immigration, the first approach is, hey, come on, stop it. We already have our own problems, we don't want more. So in a sense, I suppose at a psychological level, creating the strength in people, this the development of capacity within government systems based on some plausible understanding of what the issues are, and also not just also trying to bring on actors in ways that don't confront them with fears. This idea, that security actors, but people say, well, we've already got our own problems, we don't want more. So. So this idea of a sensible environment is really important to the book, and is a theme that recurs throughout. So that's just a quick look at some of the issues and some of the material. Summing up, just to very briefly sum up and bring it together. So the book is really interested in the ways in which migration governance is always everywhere necessary in organisational process. Organisations of various types must develop an understanding of what's going on out there and decide what to do next. The subsequent representations become embedded in migration governance narratives that are repertoires that are narrative, social, effective, performative, and ongoing. The perceived normality, what is understood as normal about migration, creates a sensible environment that then can structure responses to crises, I think, and all of the chapters look at how this can happen in relation to events defined as crises of various types. At the regional level is crucial to migration governance beyond the state. And also, and it's an argument I've not had a lot of time to go into, but the book talks in much more detail about this, is that the globe is much more likely to be regionalised than the regional is to be globalised, that global standards need to be rendered consistent with localised norms and standards at regional level, rather than regions adapting to global templates. I think that's implications for global migration governance. So I'll bring it to a close there. Thank you very much for your attention. There's some links there where you can buy the books available from Oxford University Press, but also for those who are able to access it, Oxford University Scholarship online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this overview. Of course, time is very short, so you all have to read the book if you want to get the full package and the full insights. But for now, also, I want to remind you that if you have questions to Andrew, and also, of course, to the discussants, you can post them in the chat box below on YouTube. So this first. So thanks again so much for these insights. And I would like to hand over the word to Sandra Lavene for her input on the book and on Andrew's findings.
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, congratulations, Andrew, for this great book, major achievement. And it's really good to see that an ERC project and all the work behind it is crowned through such a wonderful book. And many thanks for inviting me also to this launch event. Let me start with what I like the most about this book and what makes it outstanding and distinctive in my eyes. For me, the most outstanding feature of the book is its reflexive, interpretive approach. In your words, what you seek to uncover, these governance repertoires, is less the content of governance, the laws, the policies, associated practices, but how decision makers in different world regions make sense of the migration phenomenon and of how this should be governed. So it would be short-sighted to praise the book only because it is one of the first book-length comparative analysis of migration governance in 4 world regions. Of course, this is in itself a significant achievement. Most of the available literature so far on regional regimes related to economic mobility or refugee protection is focused on single case studies. And there are very few comparative and even fewer so comprehensive assessments. But I think the deeper originality of this book rests in its inductive focus on how political actors make sense of the migration reality in their region and how these narratives shape not only migration governance, but also the migration reality itself. For scholars used to studying migration governance with a focus on formal and informal institutions, laws, and practices, this approach is not only original, but I would also say courageous. It moves away from the mainstream political science repertoire and crosses over to interpretive methodologies which are more prominent in other social sciences. Like every theory, this approach comes with some limitations. It is focused on bringing out what is distinctive in every region rather than what makes regional governance systems comparable in terms of commonalities and differences. However, this approach definitely has a number of outstanding advantages which come out very nicely in your analysis. And I would like to highlight 3 outstanding contributions of the book. Firstly, the interpretive approach indeed fulfills the promise of moving beyond Eurocentrism, not only with regard to our conception of what migration governance can look like, but also in terms of the analytical lenses that we apply to study these phenomena. This is important because it allows you to articulate the essence of a regional system of migration governance, such as the focus on temporariness in Asia, which downplays the aspect of individual rights and entitlements, or conversely, the human rights focus in South America, or for Europe, the Janus-based governance system with its internal openness and external closure. Second advantage and major contribution of the book, the approach developed allows you to contextualize the role of the regional layer of governance in the broader multilateral system, pointing at the limits of global approaches to migration governance or global solutions. And thirdly, but not lastly, your approach confronts the reader with one's own preconceptions of what constitutes international migration and what governance it needs. So together, this makes for a very stimulating read. And with stimulation, also some reflections come up and some questions. And I would like to address 3 points for discussion. And perhaps these points are more, inspirations for future research. The first point concerned the relationship between different layers of governance. Your focus on migration governance repertoire in terms of how decision makers make sense of the migration reality, what they should do about it, is not isolated from other layers of governance. In particular, what you refer to as the content of governance, the laws, the policies, associated practices, and also underlying normative foundations on the one hand, and another layer, I would say, are popular perceptions and attitudes towards migration. And I was wondering whether there's something particular about migration as a field, as a phenomenon, that makes it particularly important to highlight this layer of elite perceptions of governance repertoires, or whether actually your approach is one that would make a similarly important contribution also to other policy areas where we try to understand the dominant political sense-making and also the regional context of governance. But if we consider that there are these different layers of governance, the repertoires, but also the laws, the policies, and the public opinion, I was wondering, how do these different layers influence each other? How are they related? For instance, are the laws and policies a mere reflection of the governance repertoire? Or do they also shape and constrain decision makers' preferences and choices? And how does public opinion come in? How does it shape elite attitudes and vice versa? A link to this first point about the layers of governance is my second question, the relationship between continuity and change, and the explanation for change. The disclosure of these regional systems of sense-making, the governance repertoires, highlights the continuity in a region. It sort of uncovers the identity of a regional approach to migration. My concern is how to explain change in these regional repertoires. What are the factors that lead policymakers to alter their interpretation of migration concerns? Your analysis points at different instances of change over time. Prominent examples are the politicization of free movement in the European Union, which moves internal migration policy closer to external migration policy of the Union, or the repertoires that are mobilized for making sense of external migration policy. Also in South America, we see change first from the repressive approach under the former dictatorships, then to this rights-based permissive approach under left-wing governments, and again, incisive restrictive reforms under the Macri and Bolsonaro governments, for example. So how do we identify change? When is, a change of policy also associated to a change of repertoire? And what would explain how and when change occurs? And thirdly, my third question is linked to the notion of a region. What we understand by a region, of course, is not so straightforward. It is strongly shaped by political processes. But even when we have a space that is politically constituted as a region, the question is, where do migration repertoires come from in terms of a regional repertoire? How much of what we see is generally regional and homegrown? How have these narratives been shaped by historical processes in the region? And how much of it is shaped by external actors and events? For instance, in the Asian context, we find ASEAN and the Bali process. What does Australia's hegemony in the Bali process, but not in ASEAN, mean for our understanding of Asia as a region of migration governance with a proper repertoire? Do ASEAN and the Bali process really contribute to one regional approach? One point that I think is important to mention in this context is that regional migration regimes outside Europe are extremely fragmented. In no other world region we find one regional institution that jointly covers internal mobility, external migration policy, and asylum. On the contrary, we find separate treaties and organizations with sometimes overlapping, but sometimes also contrasting memberships, dealing with these different aspects of migration governance. This is the case in Asia, also in North America and in South America, and it is clear also in the cases, the institutions and the policies that you explain in your book. This makes it difficult to circumscribe the scope of one particular regional migration governance repertoire. I would say, and I would be interested in hearing how you see the commonalities across these fragmented institutions in world regions. And related to this is the interaction between actors, processes, and perceptions in a region with external actors, processes, and perceptions. How far are regional migration repertoires affected by what occurs in other world regions, including policy externalities, so non-voluntary influences, but also the outreach activities, the voluntary outreach activities of powerful states and institutions? I think this question comes up very clearly when you touch upon the African case, and you had the example of this meeting with the Egyptian policymakers and the European Union. So clearly Africa is a continent, a region where Europe has a considerable impact, but also the South American case has a component of external inspiration, and Australia's role in Southeast Asia may somehow also be conceived of as partly external to what other South Asian countries would do about migration. So these are 3 points that I was thinking about when I read your book, and I would be curious to hear more about how you interpret them through your analytical lenses. And it's just to show that certainly the book stimulates reflection and opens many pathways for future research. It's a major contribution for the literature on international migration governance. It fills a gap in terms of substance, regional migration governance, but also in terms of approach, by highlighting the importance of these understandings, the meanings, values, beliefs, and perceptions that guide political action, what you call the governance repertoire. So certainly the book will have a lasting impact on future research on migration governance beyond the state.
Thanks so much, Sandra, for these extremely inspiring questions. So before we answer them, or before Andrew answers them, I would like to ask David Fitzgerald also to bring into his perspectives on what Andrew just said, and maybe also an interaction what Sandra just said. Yes, please, David.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually to discuss this terrific book. It would be an even greater pleasure to be with you in your Tuscan villa, but this is the best that we can do during the pandemic. This spring marks the 97th anniversary of the first great attempt at comprehensive global governance of migration in Italy, no less. The front page of the New York Times on 16 May 1924 reported the opening of the Conference of 58 Countries of Emigration and Immigration, the greatest session of its kind in history. While keynote speaker Benito Mussolini lamented the restrictionist tendencies manifest at the moment in certain countries, he expressed confidence in a brighter future of cooperation. For its part, the US delegation in Rome, and at the second conference in Havana 4 years later, stated that immigration policy was a sovereign issue of purely domestic concern, and that it would not be signing the declaration. Plus ça change. Andrew Geddes has invited us to think of the possibilities and constraints of migration governance beyond the state. And this book, based on 400 interviews with elite policymakers and experts, compares 4 major world regions. It's ambitious and innovative, blending together constructivist political science, a neo-institutionalist political sociology approach, as well as cognitive psychology. Andrew raises the question not only of how ideas travel, but also which and whose ideas travel. The book is doing 2 things at once. First, it argues for the importance of repertoires in explaining governance, outputs, and outcomes. And second, it argues that the regional level shapes those repertoires. There's a lot to be learned from this approach. The book is packed with relevant insights, some of which we've already heard in Andrew's presentation and Sandra's remarks, about that relationship between region and repertoire. But as with any approach, there are costs as well as benefits. The first cost is that if one were to single-mindedly set out to uncover the origins of migration governance repertoires, I think the regional level would enter into the analysis, but the region might not be the unit of analysis. There's an explicit rationale for taking the region as the unit of analysis, as you've just heard in Andrew's brief presentation. It's also articulated explicitly in the book. The interplay between the regional and the global is also a major theme. But it's worth considering that there are also interplays between not just the regional and the global out in the ether, but between the regional and just a few distant states with what we might call migration governance soft power. In Latin America, for example, states have historically looked toward the US and France when elaborating their immigration and citizenship policies. Some countries don't share geographic proximity, but they do share cultural commonalities. And they have very strong repertoires of migration governance that are developed interactively. In fact, there are a couple of brief mentions in the book of the 5-country conference of the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK sharing ideas. Indeed, there's at least a 150-year history of ideas about migration governance circulating in the English-speaking settler societies, with major impacts on policies and migration patterns. Canada has emerged as a policy model around its points-based system, for example, and it influences not just the discussion in its US neighbor, but also in Singapore, New Zealand, and many other very distant countries. The growing global density of networks of experts and institutions, perhaps the kinds of people who are on this online event right now, has made it possible for ideas to diffuse across geographic and cultural divisions faster and more easily, and to allow distant middle powers to become policy exemplars. Another challenge around using region as unit of analysis is that whether we conclude there is little or much regionalism is highly sensitive to the way that region is defined. The text makes clear that migration governance, in the NAFTA sense of North America, is limited compared to the EU and even South America. I think it's absolutely right about that point. But if you extend the definition of North America to include Central America, as some do, then there's a long and ongoing history of regional governance around migration, from refugee management during and after the civil wars to the recent asylum cooperation agreements under Trump that the Biden administration is now trying to dismantle. If you consider the Pan-American region, historically that's Latin America plus the US and Haiti, did not include Canada until much later after its influence had waned. But in the early 20th century, there were a number of highly influential Pan-American institutions and expert networks that defined goals of immigration selection, especially to advance eugenicist projects. So the lenses that focus on the regions as defined in the book certainly allow us to see some dynamics, even as they obscure others. The book elaborates repertoires in the cognitive sense. It usefully draws here on insights from psychology. But repertoires also have a history that is much longer than the memory of even the most powerful individuals. Methodologically, that means it's very difficult to see a repertoire's origins, because even these individuals, these powerful policymakers, don't necessarily know the social sources of those repertoires. The more an idea has become naturalized, the less likely it is to be noticed, named, and articulated by a contemporary policymaker. I think that's the reason that the book and its many interviewees don't talk about the extensive global governance of migration that has been consolidated and it's now taken for granted. This even includes much older legally constituted migration regimes than the 1951 refugee regime. Just for a few examples, the right to exit. This was begun in individual state policies, given further impetus by an informal 1897 draft convention of non-state expert jurists, eventually found its way into soft law in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The anti-slave trading regime was imposed by a hegemonic and former mass enslaving state, Britain. The travel documentary regime had its roots in many ways in the securitization of World War I, but it was standardized via intergovernmental cooperation and treaties regulating passports and air passengers. Something that's very much with us today, health restrictions on migrants, such as special sanitary passports, quarantines, and the like. This is the result of intergovernmental cooperation with a lot of non-state expert input. This began at the regional level in Europe in 1851. There was a separate South American process beginning in 1873. It was globalized by the World Health Organization after 1948. And these regimes developed through different pathways involving variously parastatal actors, regional institutions, institutions of like-minded states that cut across geographic groupings, and global institutions. The need to consider these deep historical origins of the repertoires becomes evident to explain the situation in contemporary South America. To understand the so-called liberal tide and the relatively positive reception of millions of Venezuelans and other countries within South America, the chapter on recent shifts in South America is an essential guide. The contemporary account is necessary, but insufficient, as it were. I think we have to look much farther back into history to fully understand these repertoires. We need to look at patterns of nation-state formation in Spanish America. It becomes much more understandable that Colombia just granted legal status to 1.7 million Venezuelans, when we consider that after independence from Spain, Venezuela was part of the Republic of Gran Colombia, that in 1830 became the rump state of modern Colombia. Nation-state lines in Spanish America were largely based on arbitrary administrative divisions from colonial times. Independence from the metropole and the later state-led nationalism was directed by the descendants of settler colonialists, who often had more in common with elites in other Spanish American countries than with despised Black and indigenous populations in their own country. A recurring continental nationalism, which the book does mention, is based on cultural similarities of shared language, religion, and colonial history. The borders of the imagined national community dividing neighbors are not as sharp as in Europe, for example. So migrants from other Latin American countries are seen as less threatening. In general, there's a history of extremely low state capacity in most border regions, the product of both natural topography, remote wilderness areas, as well as the social factor, a tendency for militaries in South America to be used for internal repression rather than fighting neighbors. When migrants cross those territorial boundaries, it doesn't generate as much political heat as it does in the other regions discussed in the book. I think the book is absolutely right that the liberal tide in South America is a reaction to the end of the right-wing dictatorships in the 1980s, but it's also a return to South America's long-standing liberal asylum policies. More than 3 decades before any multilateral European treaties to manage refugees in the League of Nations era, the Montevideo Convention in 1889 established South America's often forgotten vanguard position in creating a diplomatic and territorial asylum regime, reinforced in many subsequent conventions at a Latin American level. And in contrast to Southeast Asia, the supposition that most migrants should become permanent immigrants, as in North America also, it's revealed in almost universal policies of jus soli dating back to the 19th century. So taken together, we see these deep historical legacies of relatively weak nation-state boundaries, a discursive continental nationalism, and a strong tradition of asylum and openness to permanent immigration. That goes a long way toward explaining contemporary South American repertoires of migration governance and this relatively favorable reception of people fleeing Venezuela. My final question is to invite further reflection about the place of the academy in all this. In the US, think tanks play a critical role in this field. Think tanks are lily pads for politicians and officials on the outs who interact with think tank researchers as these politicians and officials await their chance to jump back into office. Think tanks gain legitimacy by presenting evidence that appropriates scientific techniques of citations, of explicitly stating a methodology of a study, for example. To use the felicitous term in the book, they produce policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. The book notes that academics are part of a system of migration governance. But given that, as you've just heard, the standard for evidence in migration governance repertoires is plausibility rather than accuracy, what, if anything, does the academy have to offer that think tanks don't? It's an uncomfortable question for many of us, including me, and I'd be curious to hear your views. To summarize, this book is a tour de force. I congratulate Andrew for pulling it off. If you are interested enough to be with us online right now, I encourage you to read it, engage it, and see where it takes you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. So I would like to ask Andrew now to briefly respond to both of the comments, and then we would go over to the questions we have from the audience, since we already have quite some questions also from there. So just a brief reminder, so lots of stimulating, lots of food for thought. One is about the interrelations between different layers of governance, laws, policies, normative foundations, and attitudes. The question is also the explanations for change, also the notion of the region, what is actually regional about the region, and then also connected to what was said now again about the region. So what is the region? What is its influence? But also what about tacit knowledge, I would say, and what about historical legacies? Yeah, so to wrap it up, so these are the questions by the discussants. So if you could just respond to that briefly, Andrew, before we go.
Thanks. Well, I don't think it'd be possible to respond briefly. I mean, the comments are because they're from two people whose work has had a profound influence on the field itself. So I mean, I'll try and I do know that people have been engaging as well with this. So that thanks to Sandra and David. It's fantastic to get your comments and feedback on this project. Just to pick up on some of the issues, I mean, Sandra did say there's something particular about migration that makes it important. That kind of struck me as quite an interesting point. And it's something I've been thinking about, is you think, well, what do you do next when you finish a 5-year project? Where do you go next? And I think there is something, well, maybe that there are analogous issues which have a transnational dimension, where there may be similar processes that could be investigated, and are now beginning to think about work around climate and environmental change. So I think, but it's a very important point, and I suppose it's where do you go next after you do this kind of work, which is really focused only on one concern with a kind of a transnational and transgovernmental focus. The relationship between the layers is a really good point, and I suppose it's going to be. I don't think you can provide some kind of off-pat answer to this question, but I suppose what I'm trying to do in the book is maybe, but I suppose it's maybe refer to it as this kind of the ongoing processes. So you talked about how policies shape preferences, how attitudes shape policies. So you have these feedbacks and interaction effects. I suppose one of the things I didn't do so much was almost like the process tracing. I was very focused on a particular set of concerns because of my perception that the field itself has been very dominated by a focus on the outputs of governance systems. But we've and not all the material that obviously not all the material that we gathered was able to go in the book. So there's quite a lot of material in the kind of a lot of interview material, which is very focused on what actors think the public want. And and often it's perceptions of perception. So how people perceive public attitudes, public understandings of the issues, and what they think they should be doing based on those plausible, not necessarily accurate understandings. So these kind of feedback effects and the way that they are interpreted is really important. And obviously change and continuity. I suppose I won't go into all the details, because I think the chapter in the book, if you contrast the chapter in the book on South America and Europe, the South American chapter is looking at, I think, a repertoire that has changed. And I take on board David's comments about the deep historical roots of this, and obviously his own work with David Cook-Martin has made huge contributions to our understanding of this. But I think there was a significant change in the repertoire in South America. And I do think it was because the kind of factual beliefs about migration, the social context in which those beliefs were discussed at national level, their attachment to regional projects, not just Mercosur, but also UNASUR, which obviously is now encountering more difficult times, an effective dimension linked to the experience of the people we interviewed, who often themselves have experienced harsh, repressive laws, policies, or periods of exile. Also the kind of the performative, the desire to contrast with North America, with Europe, in terms of that was also quite important. So I think that the framework that I tried to develop has some resonance in the context of a region where there was change, although I take on board David's point that change was quite very deeply rooted. I mean, I'm not sure I could. I'm quite conscious of time. But I suppose there are some questions about Africa which I might get back to, and some, because I think they might relate to some of Sandra's points as well. So maybe as we get back to some of the questions, I could return to some of the points that Sandra made, because I've seen some of the questions coming in. I mean, David's comments are fantastic. I suppose research is always about choices, and sometimes those choices, can be, they have costs, and and I think it goes to the point you made, where in terms of the repertoire, the actors themselves articulating perceptions and understandings without necessarily knowing sources of those perceptions and understandings. And that's not something we really, we were able to investigate in the context of the work. And I don't think we were just kind of very focused on the here and now, but I do think that the kind of the lens that we adopted, the focus that we had, and the way that I've tried to articulate that in the book has some cost. And I think you've drawn out very beautifully there the kind of cost that it can have in terms of the kind of deeper roots and origins. Some things are unspoken, or sometimes are spoken and referred to, which are fundamental to these repertoires. And I suppose a kind of a, maybe, I suppose what, as I now think about having done this work, where I could take it, I think there are, is thinking about ways in which you're able, I could be able to, I suppose, drill down more deeply to explore, try to explore a little bit more about the historical origins of this. I know it's a point that's also been made on the questions that have been coming in on YouTube, but I did also want to, and I'm sorry if I'm gabbling a little bit here as I try and think and speak at the same time, which aren't my main strengths. The point you made at the end, I really wanted to get to that, which is on reflection on the place of the academy, because here I am directing something called the Migration Policy Centre at EUI. I didn't call it the Migration Policy Centre, and we don't make migration policy. What we try and do is gather data and evidence that can help inform a range of actors involved in migration governance, which could be governments, could be civil society organisations. We work with a range of partners. And as you point out, we are necessarily also actors in this process. And the European University Institute has close links to the European Union through its funding, through its mission, the very core of what it seeks to do and its identity as an organisation. So that locates us in our field of study. And so as a researcher, I'm conscious of that, where I work, how we engage with policy. But you use this fantastic phrase, the lily pad. And I've not thought about that before, but that's a wonderful way of putting it. The kind of lily pad. And what we found, and I wasn't able to get it into the book because we had so much material, but we very frequently found reference to certain think tanks who are very present, very closely connected to government, are very good at mobilizing evidence in ways that could be seen to correspond with what you referred to, and I refer to in the book as policy-based evidence making, maybe to confirm existing choices rather than necessarily to legitimate those choices rather than to fundamentally change them. And I think that then means that, well, what does that mean for the academy? I mean, that's something that actually we've been quite engaged with within the MPC here as we think about this, more generally about what centres like our own should be doing. But what we found, and I suppose it's, it may be uncomfortable for the audience, for those of us who are academics, is that academic research was often not highly valued by the people we were interviewing. So it was for various reasons about the way that research was presented, but also maybe some suspicion about the motives of researchers. So we do have people who would tell us the first thing they do is they Google the person who's producing it and have a look at what, and say, well, can I take this? Where's this person coming from? Before they then look at the evidence that they present. But so I think that's a really important point. Maybe going to some of the questions, I can pick up on some of the other points that were made.
Thanks so much. Yes, there was so much food for thought now that it's true that always we would need 5 other webinars to just touch upon them, but still to also thank the audience for all their questions. I also want to bring these questions in now. The first one is a very classical question. I think, Andrew, you heard already why you didn't include Africa. So I will collect them now and then you can. So this is a question by Katerina Potinius. So why not including Africa? Then we have a question by Leonora Torres. How would you think of inclusion of migrants according to your findings? Did you touch upon this? Then there is a question by Maria Chiara Vinciguerra, who wants to know what Europe learned from other regions in terms of migration priorities. So, and how you think policymakers could go beyond risk averseness. This is one question. And we have a question by Elise Coyne about overarching patterns of frames you found. And then also a question by Johanna Bögel, how you think also these factors you found apply in migration governance in Africa. And yes, and then about historic experiences, the historic experiences that were part of contemporary conversations in other regions, For instance, the role of Vietnamese refugees in Southeast Asia, did this play also a role in other regions? Did it come up? And then a question by Florian Trauner about, would you have any key recommendations to policymakers based on your research? And then the two last questions, sorry, lots of questions here. Yeah, if some interviewees also referred of different forms of violence that are part of migration governance. And another one about migration governance in Central America. Why do you consider that this region fails to establish a governance framework? So these are all the questions so far, lots of different questions. Maybe you can pick out some that you think are relate also to the discussant's inputs.
Yes, thank you, Lila. Thanks for the great questions, which I think refer to some of the themes that have already been raised. Africa, well, there's a kind of more prosaic explanation. I originally submitted this proposal with Africa included, and it was rejected because it was said it wouldn't be possible to do the amount of work that was required. And so I had to think about how to rescale the project. So what we are now doing, and I've recently published some work with my colleague Mahari Tadeli-Maru, is develop work in parallel, which is not included in the book, which is now thinking about African regionalism and looking at the governance of migration in Africa, and that's become part of an ongoing project of work. So there is a kind of prosaic reason why African regionalism wasn't included, and it had to be a choice about cases. And I decided to go with South America, North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. But what we are now trying to do is, and we recently published a paper through the MPC with Mahari Tadeli-Maru, in which we begin to develop an agenda of work on migration governance in Africa, and I've got some ideas about future project work. So it is an omission from the book. But I would also say that we did produce a book which came out a couple of years ago, edited by Lila, Marcia Vera-Espinosa, Leza Bruma, and myself, on the dynamics of regional migration governance, which is an edited collection to which Sandra also contributed, which does contain chapters on African regional migration governance, which was a kind of product of this project. On Leonora's question about how do you define a successful path of inclusion for migrants, well, I suppose the book itself isn't really focused on specifically on that kind of question, but I think that if you look at, hopefully I'd encourage you to look at the book, and I think that you can see more or less successful paths, things that have been done, which I think you could see for yourselves and judge for yourselves as more or less successful. I think there's some very, what's happening in, say, South America at the moment in relation to the people that are displaced from Venezuela makes a very interesting contrast to what happened in Europe to people displaced from Syria. Now, I don't think in the book itself, I'm not trying to assess whether or not it is successful or a failure, but I think that there are, in all the cases I present quite a large amount of empirical material, which I think if you engage with it could help to understand more about what could be more or less successful ways of creating pathways for inclusion. Lila read so many different questions. I'm going to have to go back to YouTube onto the thing to see what.
Yes, maybe also it hasn't come up yet, but it has come up now, namely Brexit by Alessio D'Angelo, who is asking about Brexit. How would you read this in light of key arguments of the book? Maybe that's a very tangible question that brings us back to Europe, to the current developments. Yes, maybe you want to say also something how your findings can be read. Or
well, I don't deal with Brexit very specifically in the book, but I'm very happy to talk about it because we dealt with it in other research. Brexit it's not a theme of the book. I think it's mentioned in kind of passing, but I suppose one of the, if you look at the experience of the UK in relation to the EU, it was defined in relation to particular understandings of migration and its effects. And the reason, one of the core reasons that Britain left the European Union was the ability of the Eurosceptics and Europhobes to equate free movement by EU citizens with migration by people from outside of the EU, and to create this general level of concern about migration. Migration became a highly salient political concern in Europe and was central to the decision to leave the European Union. So while I don't look specifically at that in the book, I think that use and abuse of the migration issue by key political actors in the building of a coalition which managed to change the meaning of EU freedom of movement and turn it into a migration issue was central to the decision to leave the European Union. And I've published something on this with my colleague here in the MPC, James Dennison, where we look more closely at that in a separate output in the Journal of European Public Policy a couple of years ago.
Maybe another question we could take up is the question about policy recommendations, some key recommendations to policymakers, but maybe also to link it to David's questions, what might be also recommendations for us as researchers, like what we can take away also from the sense-making processes.
Well, I think that, yeah, that kind of is a sort of a question from Florian Trauner, so thanks for that. I mean, the book itself isn't really making policy recommendations. So it's not designed, but I think it perhaps, going back to Lila's point, has implications for what we do as researchers. One of the joys of having funding from the ERC is that there's no requirement to have impact. Many grants now require you to have impact on various kinds of stakeholders. The European Research Council doesn't require you to do that. But I mean, I suppose here, in many of these things, you're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. So, what I do in the book is I refer quite a lot to the work of my colleague Christina Boswell in the University of Edinburgh, and David referred to this as well, looking at the uses of evidence for policy, the kind of more instrumental use, the idea of evidence-based policy making, but also maybe the more practical realities of this, where evidence and data are used to legitimate existing policy choices or existing institutional roles. So I think it can be, it's quite a difficult path for academics and academic researchers to steer. And it's one to which academic researchers are not always well suited, and some choose deliberately not to engage with policy processes. And on the lily pad, as David referred to it, are already quite strongly present various kinds of organisation, think tanks, but also international organisations, research capacity, which are much more directly prepared to kind of express policy recommendations. I think if you were to, the words that kind of strike most fear into me usually are, what are your policy recommendations? I find it very hard to articulate policy recommendations, but also at the same time thinking, well, who am I to articulate policy recommendations? I was involved a long time ago in some work with the UK government Office for Science on migration environmental change. And we were given very strict instructions by our civil servants working with us. But our job wasn't to make policy recommendations. Our job was to provide the best available evidence and data to the people who were charged with making the decisions, the civil servants and ministers. Our job was to provide evidence and data. And perhaps create some kind of framework in which that could be interpreted and evaluated. Now, how that then occurs is in a sense beyond us, but it's a question we all have to deal with. And I suppose as I said before, I find it very difficult to, I can find it very difficult to articulate policy recommendations. That's based on my own experience. And I mean, if you are going to articulate a policy recommendation, then you also have to say, well, who will do it? How long will it take? How much will it cost? How do you know if it's been achieved? I don't think you can just say, well, this is what I think should be done, because that's not how policy works. And often academics aren't particularly attuned to some of the actual, the budgeting and temporal issues that necessarily are associated with any policy process, and also the evaluation steps that are necessary to judge if a policy is or is not successful.
Maybe one question we also could go back to, because it's one of the key elements of the book, is the issue about risk averseness. So yes, how this can be addressed, or maybe also to be more closer to what the book is about, how can we understand also this risk averseness?
Well, it's something I develop in the book, because the original project was called Prospects for International Migration Governance, and drew, and as does this book, from prospect theory, which would hypothesize that actors in a position of gains in relative position to strengthen the system are very likely to exhibit a status quo bias and be risk averse. So I think one of the arguments in the book is that relatively powerful actors in the international migration governance system may be risk averse, not because they think the current system is ideal, but because they are aware that they have a fear of making changes because of the potential unintended effects of changes. So, and so to illustrate, and again, I think I make the point in the book, and I'll just mention it briefly now. I think climate is a very good example of this, because when we did our interviews, we always asked people, what do you think are the main causes and effects of migration? And the main causes of migration, And almost always people would say, well, obviously it's economic and political factors, relative inequalities of income and wealth, or conflict within or between states. But then we asked them, well, what do you think these are likely to change, and other factors might become more important? And then across all our regions, climate will be mentioned, but always as something that was projected into the future. So even though clearly climate, environmental change have had effects and are having effects on migration decisions, climate was an issue that was projected into the future, which we think, we concluded said something about maybe the reactive tendencies of migration governance systems, the tendency to be risk averse for those in a position of gain in those systems.
And maybe still two other questions still came in, and I think which are very nicely to round up also this discussion. Namely, one question came, how far can a regional approach be successful at all? How much wouldn't we need a global approach, as we see maybe now also from the current policy developments? And the other question we got is like, what would you say, what do you think are some important themes that should be explored following also your insights and your publication? So what next? What we already touched upon also with the discussants. So what's next? What to do next? So how to make sense making of the book?
Thanks. Well, the first question about the regional and the global, I suppose one of the core arguments of the book, and to talk about those sort of global compacts on migration and refugees and other international initiatives. But one of the arguments is that shifts in the global normative environment, such as the Global Compact, don't necessarily lead to normative and institutional changes at regional level at the expense of pre-existing normative frameworks and regional arrangements. And I think that's one of the key kind of the core arguments within the book, and chapter 7 of the book goes into that in more detail. So, there is quite significant already existing global migration governments with very important historical antecedents. So that, but I think that to be effective, well, we only have to look at the Global Compact itself, which refers 54 times to the regional, the cross-regional, the sub-regional as the kind of as a key mechanism by which the global becomes meaningful in regional settings. In terms of, well, what's next, as I say, is that there's ongoing work here where I'm trying to develop with a range of partners and collaborators on migration governance in Africa, working with other researchers on that, and some work that I've been involved with here. But I also think, going back to one of the points that Sandra made, which is the distinctiveness of the migration issue, it occurs to me that there might be a way in which this kind of work could be developed, which could also perhaps have a migration displacement angle, but link perhaps to other transnational concerns around the climate crisis, and perhaps also change the regional focus to look at other parts of the world as well. Because I'm very interested in exploring in more detail a kind of, well, I suppose the kind of cognitive and kind of metacognitive foundation. I think there might be scope in the future to develop that in ways that take some of the ideas from the MIGPROS project forward. But having just taken, because, well, I suppose this book itself, it began and I thought it would take a year. It took me 3.5 years. So I'm in no hurry to do anything on this scale again.
Thanks so much also for all your insights and also for all your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get round to all of them, but there were so many and quite different angles. But I think what I can promise that we collect all of them and keep them in mind also, and it will also, of course, lead further discussions. Maybe I would like to thank you all again and maybe put the final word also to David and Sandra to close up and yeah.
No, I would just reiterate that it's a really impressive piece of scholarship, and you can tell from the discussion and all these different questions that it leads to really interesting questions. that remain to be answered about these processes at many different levels in many other regions. It's impossible for one book to write the history of the world, but I think we have some tools here that can be very usefully applied to many other contexts. So congratulations again, Andrew.
Well, I couldn't say more. I think you really inspire future scholarship, both for the subject itself, but also for the approach. I find this really stimulating to try to get better at the social psychological component of governance.
Could I just say something? Sorry, Lyle, just about me not to say I wanted to thank David and Sandra. I really appreciate it. I know, and also for David with the time difference on the West Coast of America. It's really, really grateful. Because, and also just to reiterate that the work that they've done has had such a huge influence on me and many of the people who are participating. So it's great to get their comments. And also just to say that I'm very happy to talk about this book. I do feel as though I've been talking very quickly, trying to compress a book into half an hour of presentation. So if anybody, in this world of webinars, I'm available. So I'm very happy to talk about the book if anybody wants me to log into jump into their Zoom room. I'm available, so just get in touch with me.
Again, thanks much to everybody for following and for listening and for your engaging questions, engaging comments, and thanks so much. It was really an honor and a pleasure also to be part of this book launch, and I wish you all a wonderful afternoon and lots of more thinking going around the regional, global, and migration governance. Thanks so much to Andrew, David, and Sandra, and all of you out there.